I'm going to talk to you about some common mistakes that we see from the supply chain side as it comes to relating or setting a price for a supplier to a retailer. I'm not going to sit here and talk about pricing strategies. If you went to Wikipedia, Wikipedia says there's 22 different pricing strategies to go to market with. So I'm not going to get into the 22 different pricing strategies as it relates to setting a price in the marketplace. What I'm here to talk about today is the price that you set from a supply chain standpoint to give to a retailer. It goes into your cost of goods sold. We see hundreds of small to mid-size CPG companies every year entering the marketplace, whether it be new suppliers or suppliers that have grown up and they now need a real supply chain or whatever the case may be. So we see a lot of mistakes every day that people make or don't make, and as a result are successful in keeping their product on the shelf in the retailer, which is the ultimate goal. As you see up here, I've got a lot of words on this slide that have multiple meanings that you would have to determine your strategy going to the retailer. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that going through a distributor is better than going direct versus direct import versus all the other different modes of a supply chain. That is your responsibility as a supplier to figure out. But when you start looking at all those words, every single one of those ultimately have a price or an impact on your price that you would set going to a retailer. What I'm going to focus on is more helping you understand what are some of the cost drivers that you should take into account in setting your price. We don't want you to just pull out, well, transportation and logistics is 6% of cost of goods sold, and use that and think that you're going to be successful. So that's more of my intent this morning, what I'm going to talk about. The title of this slide is Inadequate or Irrelevant Analysis. And the one thing that we see continually, especially in the small to mid-sized CPG world, is normally you're talking about a company that's being run or driven by sales and marketing people. And that's great. I've got a sales and marketing background, but sales and marketing people sometimes want to get to market as fast as they can, and they don't really take into account the supply chain. I think the one thing that you've heard common this morning from several different people, whether it be the panel and the questions that were asked or any other presenter this morning, is at the end of the day, the supply chain is what is going to separate you from your competition and your success to maintain your space on the retail shelf. A lot of companies come and go. They may have the best product in the world, but if you don't have the supply chain and you don't know how to control your costs, you're not going to last for very long in this business. And the supply chain is one of the things that you can truly, if you spend your due diligence and you spend the time on, you can control that cost function, and it will allow you to be successful. The first topic that I'm going to talk about is not all retailers are equal. What do you think I mean by that? Not all retailers are equal. What I mean by that is you can't set a price for the market on a cost per case basis or a cost per pound or whatever method that you use to set your pricing. General. You can't have, I'm $1 a case for all retail. If you do that, you're not going to be in business for very long. The reason that you can't do that is all retailers' supply chains are different. Walmart has 42 regional distribution centers. They also have high velocity, they also have grocery, they also have pharmacy, they have lots of different supply chains. But if we were just talking about their 42 regional distribution centers, when a buyer goes to order your product for placement into those 42 regional distribution centers, It's a lot different than a retailer that has 2 distribution centers, or 4 distribution centers, or 10 distribution centers, or even 20 distribution centers. What do I mean by that? The order sizes that they're going to order into each one of those distribution centers are considerably smaller than what you're going to get going to a much different supply chain retailer that only has 2 or 4 or 10 distribution centers. So if you use the principle of setting a price of full pallet in, full pallet out going to Walmart, unless you have a really good buyer agreement, you're not going to get orders of full pallet in, full pallet out going into the Walmart 42 DCs. Walmart only has 42 DCs, and they are not going to build any more regional distribution centers. So they have to find ways to maximize the efficiencies of those distribution centers. So they're not giving slotting spaces, pallet slotting spaces, to small to mid-sized CPG companies. They're saving those for great value, price first, equate, and then the big CPG behemoths that have high velocity that justify full pallet in, full pallet out. They're going to order from you guys type 33 or assembly orders, which are just basically a cross dock through their DC. So it sits in their DC for a very short period of time and doesn't take up any slotting spaces. The converse to that is if you go to a company like Publix or Kroger or Wegmans or Safeway or Albertsons, if you're talking on the grocery side, they have much fewer distribution centers, and they have a different strategy. They're going to want to buy from you in either full pallet quantity, in half truck quantity, in 3/4 truck quantity, or in full truck quantity. It's a completely different supply chain and a completely different cost that you could offer to them versus if you're getting partial case quantities or you're getting mixed case quantities on a pallet, which Walmart could easily order. Let's say you have 5 SKUs and you average 100 cases per pallet per SKU. Walmart may order 5 cases of each SKU, and you only have 25 cases on a pallet. Your cost to pick, pack, fulfill, and deliver that to the 42 DCs is completely different than a full truck or a half a truck going into a Peyton's DC for Kroger. So you have to understand by retailer what your costs are. And as simple as that sounds, we see hundreds of examples every year of companies that just say, it's $1 a case anywhere in the country, and that's it. And they wonder where their margin is, and 6 months later, they wonder why the bank's calling their note because they have no reserve. So that's what I want to talk about today and get into detail today is what are the things that you need to understand to maintain your margins by retailer. Not all retailers are equal. I can sit here and talk literally on this one topic probably all day long, and I only have 30 minutes, so I'm probably going to move on very quickly. Another thing that I want to point out when I say not all retailers are equal is you'll hear sometimes when you're doing distribution into Walmart, as an example, they're so expensive. Their cost to fulfill their orders is so expensive. Again, they're ordering type 33 POs. They can order potentially one case per DC per week if your sell-through rate is that expectation. They could order one case per week to a DC as a minimum. And you think, oh my God, that's so expensive. It cost me so much money to deliver that one case. True. But if you wanted to be in another store that carries slotting, or they charge slotting fees, you may spend $100,000 on the front end just to get slotting fees into a particular retailer. It's coming out of your marketing budget. It's not necessarily coming out of your supply chain budget. So there's 2 different people within the organization looking at it. Your supply chain guy's going, it's expensive, it's expensive, it's expensive. If you look at the whole picture, marketing spent $100,000 just to get on the shelf. Well, you spend $100,000 and there's no guarantee your product sells. Retailer wants you to come pick it up. Walmart doesn't work that way. There are no slotting fees in Walmart. So it's a risk that you take. You may spend a little more on the front end to get the traction going and to get more store counts and to get more product placement on the shelf. But you've got to take those costs into account and understand the whole cost of the picture and realize that not all retailers are equal. Therefore, you can't set one generic price and be successful selling in the retail world. Not accounting for all the costs. Sounds pretty simple, but there's 3 aspects of the supply chain that you have to account for. Inbound transportation, whether that be from your co-packer, your co-man, import, raw materials, whatever it is, you got to account for the inbound transportation, you got to account for the warehousing and fulfillment, and then you got outbound transportation. Those are the 3 main buckets that you have to account for. It is amazing to me when we start talking to suppliers about how they develop their cost per case that nobody factors in inbound transportation. They just assume that's a cost that they're going to have no matter what, and they don't factor that in to the actual shelf price that they're giving to a retailer. Well, the other thing that's interesting to me in the years that I've talked to suppliers is suppliers get really concerned about warehousing costs. Warehousing costs are important, no doubt. But warehousing costs are only 1/3. Transportation is 2/3, inbound and outbound. Warehousing is not where your dollars are going to go. Your dollars are going to go in transportation when you factor in inbound and outbound transportation. So you have to realize that transportation costs will, in the end, be more important to you and something that you want to be focused on more than warehousing costs. Don't get me wrong, warehousing costs are very important. But as an example, let's say one of the factors that you have in warehousing is storage. And somebody may have a storage rate of $5 and somebody may have a storage rate of $5.50. You think, oh my God, that's 10% higher. I can't do this. This is going to kill me. How many pallets are you going to have in inventory for the year? 100, 200, 10,000, a million, whatever it is. Multiply that by 50 cents over a year. It's pennies compared to $5 on every transportation shipment that you're sending in or out. That's where it adds up real quickly. $5 a shipment or 50 cents for a pallet, and you have hundreds of cases per pallet. You got to understand what drives the numbers and where the levers are. You can't get hung up on warehousing costs per se. They're important, but really focus on transportation and understand that transportation is 2/3 of your total spend when you're talking about supply chain. And it's amazing how many companies don't understand that. They think warehousing is the biggest driving cost. I'm going to move on to the next topic. Not account for all the costs. So, real quick, I talked about inbound transportation, I talked about warehousing, and I talked about outbound transportation. The other thing that you need to factor in is personnel cost. And what do I mean by that? Companies that don't have a supply chain employee or a transportation manager or whatever you want to call it, I hope they're outsourcing. You need to have somebody, whether it be internal or external, there needs to be cost attributed to the supply chain. If you talk to Walmart, if you talk to P&G, if you talk to ConAgra, if you talk to any of those companies, at the end of the day, what truly makes them or separates them or what has made them is the supply chain. So if you are not going to spend the resources to have internally as a supply chain, you need to find a good outsource partner that understands and can work with you and collaborate with you to help you go to market. Which takes me to the next one. Lack of customer adjustable inputs. What do I mean by that? Lack of customer adjustable inputs. What I mean by that is there are so many variables, like we've been discussing, that drive cost. And one of the things that you should be able to do, either internally or if you outsource it, is use analytics that are based on customer adjustable inputs. I'm going to go to the next slide. I don't know if y'all can see this very well, but this is a Walmart store matrix that at some point, if you haven't ever seen one, hopefully you will see one, because it means you've gotten to the point that you're having a conversation with your buyer about where you're going and what they're going to do with you. And this is just a typical store matrix. I've cut the other 40 DCs off of it, but if you can see in the gray cells, one says Coleman, Alabama 6006, and in the white it says Mount Pleasant 6009. Those are two of the regional distribution centers. And if you go down into the rows, row 5 or 6 there, you'll see a vendor name, and then you'll see a UPC. If you go over in the column, you'll see UPC, and then you'll see an item description. And then you get over to Coleman, Alabama. It currently shows you at 0, and it shows you proposed 14 for Coleman, Alabama for one SKU, and 36 for another SKU, and 20 for another SKU. That means that your buyer is projecting to put that SKU for that DC in 36 or 14 or 20 stores. Walmart DCs ship to multiple stores. On average, a DC services somewhere between, depending on the DC, 80 to 100 stores. Average is typically around 85 to 90 stores is what a DC services. And that changes as Walmart continues to add stores. Those numbers change constantly, but the bottom line is this is a matrix that you're going to have a conversation with your buyer. You go over to the far right where it says total, you'll see proposed for one SKU 755, for another SKU 644, for another SKU 1,870. Sounds awesome. I'm going to go to 1,870 stores. There's one SKU up there that's 644 stores, or 664, whatever it is, 644. Those are the type of situations that you better understand your supply chain and your costs. Because 644 stores isn't necessarily equal. 644 stores spread across 42 DCs, 12, 14 DCs per DC, 12 to 14 stores per DC. Or you could have 100 in one DC and 100 in another DC and 50 in another. That drives your costs, significantly can impact your cost on how that's allocated, how it's spread out. So you need, when it comes to pricing, to have analytics that are customer adjustable inputs. And what I mean by that is if you spread this spreadsheet out over 42 stores and you could see where those 644 stores were and those 1,870 stores were and those 755 stores were, you might be able to sit down with your buyer in real time and say, my current cost per case with this distribution projection is $1. But if we can tweak it, still keep me at 755 stores, but shift it, and instead of being in 10, 10, 10, 14, 20, make it 50, 50, 50, 50, as just simple numbers, my cost per case goes from $1 to 85 cents. And you can have that live conversation right there with your buyer in real time, and they can see how the impact of the supply chain impacts your costs, and you can see the impact to your costs based upon allocation. And I promise you, buyers don't necessarily know that if I have you in 10 stores on the West Coast DC and then the rest of your business is east of the Mississippi, they don't necessarily know that those 10 DCs are killing your cost per case. What they know is there's a market out there, Nielsen or RI or whoever is telling them there's a market in these 10 stores for this product. And I want to test it out there and see how it does, and if it does really well, I may put them in every West Coast DC, but these are the 10 stores that I think are very important to making this work, and I'm going to test them there. Well, that's great, but those 10 stores may completely drive your cost per case one way or the other, up or down or whatever it may be. So I guess where I'm trying to go is make sure that, number one, you're not going in with, I'm going to have full pallet in, full pallet out. If anyone that you talk to tells you that you can price it and have the assumption of full pallet in, full pallet out, you're going to get burned, and it's going to cost you greatly. You may not lose your business. You may be able to persevere through it, but from a margin standpoint, it's going to kill you. It's going to pinch you. It's going to squeeze you if you make the assumption full pallet in, full pallet out. And then if you have tools like what I'm talking about here, where you can have customer adjustable inputs and adjust all the factors that impact, even if it's not live with the buyer, before you ever go into the meeting, you have a strategy. You can formulate a strategy and know how to steer the conversation with the buyer by understanding, I need this, or I want to be here, or I think they're wrong in the approach, and I need to be able to show them. And the thing about it is, if you have the ammunition to back yourself up, most buyers are going to listen to you. And that's what separates successful companies from unsuccessful companies, is preparation, due diligence, and proof to back it up. So if you have tools that can help you with these customer adjustable inputs, it's going to separate you from your competition, because very few people understand the drivers that impact that cost per case. The other last bullet point up there is using last year's data for this year's business. And obviously, last year is a great indicator of what trends are or what your costs may be. And I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't factor last year's business in. Always use last year's business as a baseline. But if you're going to set your price solely based upon what you did last year, again, you're making a mistake. And we see lots of suppliers do it. Supply chain costs, on average, increase somewhere between 4 and 10% annually. And in today's market, it's going to be a much steeper increase, especially for small to mid-sized companies. It's going to be a much steeper increase quicker. Why? The factors in the supply chain are changing. Capacity is tighter, and it's driving costs up at an unprecedented rate in the industry. So utilizing last year's information to set a price today, or for the next 2 years or 3 years, you're killing yourself. Don't just use last year's numbers. There's so many other factors that you have to take into account. Does anybody in here have containers sitting in California for months? If you didn't, you're lucky. But you have to understand that one event created a change in the supply chain, and from a cost standpoint, overnight. And it wasn't just the longshoremen not wanting to unload containers. It started filling and backfilling and backfilling. And then once those containers got released, everybody had to get their product out of there. It becomes a bidding war for a truck. There's only so many trucks on the road. There's only so many hours a day that truck can run. So it changed capacity and it changed costs. That one event, as an example. We have a major snowstorm in the U.S. We've had a couple in the last few years. One major weather event can back up rail yards, can back up ship unloading container yards for weeks. And again, it causes capacity crunches, which causes rates to get out of hand. That impacts your costs. So you have to, again, going back to personnel, have somebody internally that knows how to mitigate this stuff, or you have to have a good partner that can work with you to help you control your costs. But when it comes to giving a price, pushing a price across the table to a buyer, you have to understand all the things that are impacting that price. Right now, I don't know if anybody here go to YBM? Your beginning meeting with Walmart? There was a headline this morning. Walmart is currently squeezing suppliers to lower their costs. Real. It's one of the ways that they feel they can get same-store sales up. Have cheaper price on the shelf. Bring more customers in. So they're leaning on the suppliers to help them offer that everyday low cost that they want to the supplier. You set a price today based upon last year's cost, and Walmart comes to you wanting to help squeeze some pennies out so they can offer a better cost on the shelf. Last year's numbers and the market has changed. You don't have anywhere to go. So there's a lot of factors that come into play on the supply chain side that you can control, work with the right people, and have a vision of where things are going. We talked about the store matrix. Looks funny, sounds like a joke. It's not. I can't tell you how many times a supplier comes to me and says, hey, I got my first POs. I need your help. Great, we'll go to work on it. Where's your data? They give us the data and we come back and we say, it's going to be $1 a case to ship it. They say, I can't do $1 a case. I sold it at 50 cents. I'm like, how did you come up with that number? Well, and they start telling you what they did, and they say, oh, well, we just use 6% of cost of goods sold, or we use 10% of cost of goods sold, or we use whatever percentage. If you do that, and you don't understand all the factors, you're going to get burned at some point. Before you give that price to your buyer, do the due diligence and work with somebody, whether it's internal or external, work with somebody that understands the drivers of the supply chain to get you what your supply chain costs are going to be, so you can take your supply chain costs plus your cost of goods sold, put them together, and go strategically with the right price. And understand that the price that you give Walmart is probably not the price that you're going to get at Kroger, it's not the price that you're going to give Publix, it's not the price that you should be given H-E-B or Wegmans or Roundy's or Safeway or Albertsons or Rite Aid or Walgreens or whoever it may be. Home Depot, Best Buy, whatever, Kohl's, whatever line of work you're in. Retail, each retailer is different. Not all retailers are equal. Like I said, I can sit here and talk about it all day long. These things are important to understand. Vendor compliance. Again, not all retailers are the same. Vendor compliance means something completely different at every retailer that you'll talk to. Every one of them. Some of them are going to penalize you heavily. Some of them it means guidelines. But from a supply chain standpoint, there are 7 things that vendor compliance matters on. Routing guidelines. Labeling requirements. Each retailer can penalize you or cost you a significant amount of money with labeling requirements. Can you just have a barcode on your corrugate, or do you have to print a special label just for them? Because if you're outsourcing that to a third party, they're going to charge you for each one of those labels, and that cost goes up. So you have to understand, again, not all retailers are equal. Vendor compliance is a huge component of it, and all the different factors within vendor compliance that are going to drive your costs. Shipping. You may have the best rates negotiated with carrier A. And boy, you love carrier A, and everything's going great with carrier A, and your sales guy just got you into Publix. Publix doesn't use carrier A. It requires you to use carrier D. You have no relationship with carrier D. And you go to them, and their cost to deliver Publix is 30% more than carrier A. You've got to understand these things. You have to understand what each carrier means and what the cost impacts are going to be. MABD, RDD, RAD, MABD's Walmart terminology, must arrive by due date. RDD is used by several retailers, requested due date. RAD, required arrival date or requested arrival date. There's lots of different terminology. Again, not all retailers are equal, but these are the things, just from a supply chain standpoint, these 7 things will cost you dearly if you go in with a flat cost per case for all retail. If you don't follow these 7 things, these are the 4 things that are most likely going to happen to you. Your shipment's going to get refused. You're going to get charged back by the retailer. You're going to get fined, deducted, or a penalty, or your PO is going to be canceled. What does that equate to? Out-of-stock issues, poor customer loyalty, sales, poor labor allocation within your facility warehouse. When you start losing sales, you can't use efficiency. So this slide is very simple, but I could sit here and talk probably for 3 days just on this one slide. Very important that you understand all retailers aren't equal, and all these components that will drive your costs by retailer. I am out of time, so those are the highlights of really what I wanted to touch. Like I said, I can sit here and talk for days about the supply chain and how it impacts your costs as a supplier. But just know that if you don't have the supply chain expertise, find somebody that does and partner with them, because if you don't, and you set a price by grabbing it out of the air and making a gross assumption that it's 6% cost of goods sold or 10% or 20% or whatever that number is, you can't do that and be successful. And that is the number one mistake that we see suppliers make. They don't understand the supply chain costs and how it impacts their ability to sell. And if you get too aggressive, it will cost you because you were too aggressive and your price is too high. There's 2 sides of it. You're too conservative or you weren't conservative enough. Either way, they can cost you. They can cost you the sale because you were too high on the front end, or they cost you in the long run because you're not making any money. So, thank you for your time. Am I out of time? Yeah. Yep. All right.
Thank you. Only because we have so many great speakers to get to. Thank you. Thank you.